If someone had told me I would end that Friday kissing the woman who made my life a living hell for the past 3 years, I would have laughed out of pure nervousness. But before I tell you how everything changed between us in that dark storage room, I invite you to subscribe here to the Forbidden Romances channel to follow every detail of our story of redemption. My name is Hannah. I am 28 years old, and I am what they call invisible. An efficient secretary, coming from a humble family in the suburbs, crossing the bridge every day to work in a world of luxury where I am clearly not welcome. The offices of Sterling and Associates occupy the penthouse of one of the most imposing buildings on the waterfront. Everything there was designed to intimidate, from the white marble floor that reflects our footsteps to the glass walls that show the ocean, a view I could only admire while serving coffee to millionaire clients. I always felt small in that place, smoothing down my skirts bought at discount department stores and trying to hide my working-class background, while next to me paraded the personification of everything I would never be. Allison was my antithesis, and, unfortunately, my direct colleague in the executive antechamber. Blonde, impeccable, always dressed in designer suits that cost more than my salary for 3 months, she walked through the office as if floating above mundane problems. The expensive citrus perfume she wore arrived in the room before she did, announcing her presence and tying my stomach in a knot of anxiety, because I knew that along with the scent would come some veiled criticism or a look from top to bottom. Our rivalry wasn't explicit, made of screaming matches or scenes, but built on icy silences and polite jabs that hurt much more. On that specific morning, the tension between us was unbearable, almost solid in the freezing air conditioning of the reception area. Allison had redone a report of mine without telling me, claiming to the boss that my formatting was amateurish and inadequate for the firm's standards, which earned me a public humiliation right in the first meeting of the day. I watched her while she typed frantically on her state-of-the-art computer, her posture erect like that of a ballerina or a soldier. There was something about Allison's perfection that irritated me deeply, perhaps because it seemed unattainable, or perhaps because, deep down, I felt a painful envy of all that security. I wanted to hate her with all my strength. I wanted to believe she was just a shallow and cruel woman, but my eyes insisted on betraying my anger, noticing how her hair fell perfectly over her shoulders. Our boss, Mr. Robert Sterling, was the sadistic conductor of that out-of-tune orchestra, a man who seemed to feed on others' discomfort. He knew about the animosity between me and Allison, and instead of calming things down, he threw gasoline on the fire, comparing our performance and creating ridiculous competitions. He was a rude man who masked his prejudice and chauvinism with the excuse of being demanding, and we were the favorite targets of his chronic bad mood. The afternoon of that Friday dragged on with the weight of a summer storm forming outside, the kind of heavy wind that makes the windows of high-rise buildings whistle. The sky darkened early, turning the bay down below into a gray and agitated mirror, reflecting exactly how I felt inside. I just wanted to grab my things, run to the transit terminal, and forget that place and those people existed for 2 whole days. But fate, or rather, the malice of Mr. Sterling, had other plans for us. With only 10 minutes left until the end of the shift, he opened the door of his office with a bang, holding a yellowed paper and screaming about an old lawsuit, archived over a decade ago. He was furious about some missed deadline that was certainly his own fault, but which, as always, would fall on the weakest links of the company to fix. He looked at us with that cynical smile of someone who is going to ruin someone's weekend for pure pleasure and decreed his absurd order. He said the physical file was not in the digital system, and that we needed to go down to the storage room in the basement, known as the Dead Archive, to locate that specific client's box. I tried to argue that it was already past 6 in the evening, but he just held up his hand, silencing my attempt at defense. The worst part wasn't the unpaid overtime, but the condition he imposed with a cruel gleam in his eye. He said that since we were always at war, we should go together to learn teamwork, and that we could only leave when we found the document. It was a childish punishment, a penalty disguised as a corporate task, forcing us to share a small, dusty space just when our patience with each other was hanging by a thread. We walked to the service elevator in a sepulchral silence, hearing only the aggressive sound of Allison's heels against the floor and the thunder that rumbled outside, making the hallway lights flicker briefly. I pressed the basement button so hard my finger hurt, feeling her presence beside me like an uncomfortable electric charge. Allison didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the panel numbers counting down, but I could see a muscle in her jaw tensing, betraying that she was just as furious as I was. When the metal doors opened in the basement, freezing air smelling of mold hit us, contrasting violently with her perfume. The corridor was long, dimly lit, and ended at the heavy iron door of the storage room, which looked like the entrance to a forgotten bunker. I didn't know it at that moment, but as we crossed that threshold, we would be leaving behind not only the daylight and the luxurious office, but also all the lies we told ourselves about who we were and what we felt. The Dead Archive lived up to the morbid name it carried. It was a labyrinth of gray metal shelves, crammed with cardboard boxes that smelled of mold, dust, and forgotten time. As soon as we took the first steps inside that place, I felt the heavy air enter my lungs, a damp mixture that contrasted with the artificial freshness of the floors above. The only sound was the intermittent buzzing of a fluorescent light at the end of the hall, which blinked as if it were about to give up on life, casting long and distorted shadows on the rough concrete floor. Allison stopped right at the entrance, crossing her arms and looking around with an expression of absolute disgust, as if the simple existence of that place was a personal offense to her. I could see the exact moment she held her breath so as not to inhale the stale smell, and I couldn't hold back a petty thought of satisfaction seeing her red-soled shoes stepping on the dusty floor. She looked like a porcelain doll placed on the wrong shelf, out of place and visibly irritated by having to come down from her pedestal. Without saying a word, she took her cell phone out of her purse and turned on the flashlight, refusing to touch the wall switch that was covered by a thin layer of dark grime. I rolled my eyes, ignoring her silent drama, and went straight to the section where the letters corresponding to the lawsuit should be. I knew that place better than I would like, as the task of fetching old documents always fell to me, while Allison stayed upstairs, polishing her image of untouchable efficiency. While I was dragging a rusty metal ladder to reach the highest shelf, I heard the sound that would change our destiny that night. It wasn't a loud or explosive noise, but a dry, metallic, definitive click coming from the direction of the entrance. The channeled wind of the storm howling outside must have created a draft in the ventilation ducts, pushing the heavy iron door against the frame. Allison turned abruptly, eyes wide, and we both stood paralyzed for a second, listening to the sudden silence that settled in now that the noise from the hallway had been cut off. My heart rose to my throat, but I tried to stay calm, climbing down the ladder carefully and walking toward the exit with quick steps. I told myself it was just a door slamming in the wind, something common on stormy days, and that turning the internal handle would be enough to get us out of there. I reached the door and turned the cold metal handle, but it didn't budge a single millimeter. I tried again, putting more strength into it, pushing with my shoulder, but it seemed the door had been welded to the wall. The electronic lock mechanism, which should have released the exit automatically, emitted a sharp, continuous beep, indicating a system error. The small light on the card reader, which was on the inside for security, blinked in an alarming and intermittent red. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. I swiped my badge on the reader, praying to hear the unlocking sound, but the red light blinked 3 times and the error beep sounded even louder, echoing off the metal walls. I tried one more time, swiping the card slowly, then fast, then cleaning the magnetic strip on my skirt, but the result was the same: access denied. That was when I heard Allison's voice behind me, loaded with that tone of superiority that made me grind my teeth. She asked if I was too incompetent even to open a door, walking toward me as if I were a child who didn't know how to handle technology. She pushed me slightly to the side, invading my personal space with her citrus perfume, and positioned her badge, the VIP executive badge, in front of the reader. The machine, indifferent to the office hierarchy or the price of her clothes, responded with the same beep of denial. The red light blinked in her face, mocking her authority. Allison tried again, with more force, hitting the plastic against the reader, and then began to shake the handle with a violence I didn't know she possessed. Her mask of calm began to crack, revealing an aggressive impatience. She turned to me, her face flushed with anger, and began to accuse me. She said I should have put the doorstop in, that it was my responsibility to ensure the exit remained clear, that I had done that on purpose to delay her. Her words came out fast and cutting, every sentence designed to belittle me and shift the blame, as she always did in meetings upstairs. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't lower my head. The exhaustion of the week, the morning humiliation, and the adrenaline of the moment gave me unprecedented courage. I responded in kind, saying she had entered last and that if she were as proactive as she claimed to be on LinkedIn, she would have held the door herself. Our argument echoed through the storage room, 2 raised voices disputing reason while we were locked in a concrete box 20 feet underground. We were so busy screaming at each other, pouring out years of accumulated resentment, that we didn't immediately notice what was happening with the power. The fluorescent lamp at the end of the hall buzzed loudly, like a dying insect, and blinked violently, 1, 2, 3 times. Before I could finish my sentence about her selfishness, a loud pop came from the fuse box, and absolute darkness swallowed us, silencing our voices and leaving us only with the terrifying sound of our own breathing. The darkness that swallowed us wasn't just the absence of light. It was something physical, heavy, and suffocating, as if the air itself had become solid around us. In the first few seconds, my eyes went wide, desperately trying to find any beam of clarity, any familiar outline, but the pitch black was absolute. It was as if we had been transported to the bottom of the ocean or buried alive, and the only thing remaining in that tiny universe was the sound of thunder echoing far away, muffled by the thick concrete walls of the basement. I stood paralyzed, with my hand still extended in the air where Allison's face had been, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs in an uneven rhythm. The instinct to fight, which seconds before burned in my veins, was instantly replaced by a primitive danger alert. I expected to hear her voice at any moment, complaining about the building maintenance, cursing the electrician, or making some acidic joke about how I must be to blame for the blackout, but what I received was a disturbing silence. I heard a dry sound of something falling on the floor and sliding across the rough concrete, followed by the subtle shattering of glass. I imagined it was her state-of-the-art cell phone, which must have slipped from her hand in the shock of the fuse box blowing. Without the device's flashlight, we were completely blind, depending only on touch and hearing in that freezing cubicle. The lack of vision caused me momentary vertigo, and I needed to lean on the metal shelf beside me so as not to lose my balance. I tried to maintain rationality, that practical voice that always guided me in moments of crisis at the company, telling myself it was just a power outage caused by the storm. I tried to speak, but my voice came out hoarse and shaky, asking if Allison was okay and if she could find her phone on the floor. My words echoed in the void, hitting the file boxes and coming back to me without an answer, which increased my anxiety even more. It was then that Allison's silence ceased to be just an absence of speech and became a terrifying presence. I started to hear her breathing, no longer the impatient sigh of someone who thinks they are superior, but a ragged, fast, and irregular sound. It sounded like someone who had run a marathon or who was struggling to pull air through a narrow straw. That sound, coming from the woman I knew as the authoritarian official, caused me a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I took a hesitant step toward where I thought she was, feeling the void with shaking hands. My fingers grazed the fine fabric of her blazer, and to my surprise, I felt she was shaking violently. It wasn't a shiver from cold. It was an uncontrollable vibration that ran through her entire body, as if she were coming undone right there, in front of me, dismantled by the dark. I called her name again, this time softer, and with a tone of urgency, completely forgetting the hierarchies and office fights. I asked what was happening, trying to understand why a simple lack of light had caused that devastating effect. I didn't know yet, but I was witnessing the crumbling of a lifetime of appearances, the crack in the perfect armor Allison used to protect herself from the world. She didn't respond with complete sentences, just emitted a strangled sound, like a wounded animal, that broke my heart in a way I didn't expect. She whispered something unintelligible, repeating a word that seemed to be no or stop, as if she were reliving some nightmare or fighting a monster only she could see. The arrogance, the haughty posture, the look of disdain, everything had disappeared, leaving in its place a small and terrified creature. I felt her hand grab my arm in the dark, not with aggression, but with the desperation of someone drowning. Her nails, always perfectly manicured, dug into my skin through my blouse, hurting, but I didn't pull away. On the contrary, that desperate touch was confirmation that something very serious was happening. She pulled in air with force, a sharp and painful sound, and I realized she wasn't just afraid, she was collapsing. The darkness seemed to have ripped the mask off Allison with violence. There, without the light to illuminate her designer clothes or her impeccable makeup, she was just a human woman, flawed and full of dread. I found myself in a strange and unprecedented position, that of being the pillar of support for the person who spent her days trying to knock me down. The irony of the situation didn't escape me, but it was quickly suffocated by the genuine concern that began to grow in my chest. I tried to pull away gently just to look for the door, saying I would try to open the manual lock, but her grip on my arm intensified, almost cutting off my circulation. She stammered, voice choked by the crying that was starting to rise, begging me not to leave her alone, not for a second. The vulnerability in that request was a punch to my stomach, disarming any remnant of resentment I might have held. At that moment, I realized we wouldn't be leaving there anytime soon, and that the problem with the door was the least of my worries. The true danger was in Allison's mind, which seemed to be trapped in a place much darker than that storage room. I took a deep breath, smelling her fear mixing with the mold of the archive, and prepared myself for what would come next, not knowing that this crisis would be the bridge that finally connected us. The sound that cut through the darkness wasn't a scream, but a dull and painful thud, as if a body had lost support and collapsed against the cold concrete. My heart raced, and for an instant, the anger I felt for Allison evaporated, giving way to a red alert of genuine concern. I knew she was in high heels, and in total darkness, a misstep could mean a broken ankle or hitting her head on those sharp metal shelves. I tried to call her name again, but the answer I received was a ragged gasp, a sharp sound of someone pulling for air and finding nothing. That noise chilled my spine because it wasn't crying, it was suffocation. I knew that sound, had heard it in movies or read about it, but witnessing the most powerful woman in the office emitting that noise of animal desperation, right there, 2 meters from me, was terrifying. I completely forgot where the door was, or my own irritation with the boss's punishment. I knelt on the dirty floor, not caring about my skirt, or the dust impregnating the environment, and began to feel the void in front of me, like a blind person. My fingers found the smooth fabric of her blazer, and then the cold skin of her arm, which was rigid and trembling like a violin string about to snap. Allison was curled up in a fetal position against the base of a shelf, shaking in a way I never imagined possible. Her claustrophobia wasn't a mild discomfort. It was a visceral and violent attack that had shut down all rationality. She was scratching at her own neck, trying to loosen an imaginary tie or open a passage for air, murmuring disjointed words about the walls closing in. I held her wrists firmly, trying to stop her from hurting herself, and the contact of my warm skin with hers was a thermal shock. She struggled for a second, not recognizing me in the dark, fighting as if I were one more of those shadows oppressing her. I had to use force, holding her shoulders and shaking lightly, calling her back to reality with a voice I tried to keep calm, although I was terrified myself. That was when she stopped fighting and grabbed onto me. Her hands, always so delicate and distant, grabbed the lapel of my blazer with desperate strength, pulling me down. Her face found my neck, and I felt the hot tears wet my skin, mixed with the frantic breathing beating against my ear. The wall of ice had melted completely. There was no boss or subordinate there, just two women trapped in the dark. I realized she couldn't hear me. The panic was a deafening noise in her head. So, I acted on pure instinct, doing what my mother did with me when I had nightmares in childhood. I wrapped my arms around her back, enveloping her completely in a tight and protective hug, transforming my body into a shield against the fear devouring her. I began to whisper breathing instructions right close to her ear, in a monotone and rhythmic tone. I told her to inhale with me, counting to 4, hold the air, and release slowly. I repeated this like a mantra, ignoring the smell of mold and focusing only on the scent of her perfume, which now seemed sweet and sad. I felt her heart beating against my chest in a rhythm so accelerated, it seemed it would come out through her mouth. Gradually, very slowly, her body began to yield. The rigidity of the muscles lessened, and she stopped trying to tear off her own skin. She buried her face in the curve of my shoulder, letting out a loud and pained sob, the sound of someone finally allowing themselves to break. I stayed there, stroking her hair, which was messy and damp with sweat, caressing her neck without even realizing the intimacy of the gesture. It was strange and overwhelming to have Allison in my arms. The woman who looked at me with disdain every day now depended on my embrace not to fall apart. I felt her fragility, the weight of her thin body against mine, and a wave of inexplicable tenderness took over me. I didn't want to fight anymore. I just wanted her to be okay, for that tortured breathing to return to normal. We stayed like that for a time I couldn't measure, maybe minutes, maybe an eternity, wrapped in each other on the floor of the dead archive. The silence of the storage room reigned again, but now it wasn't empty. It was filled by our proximity. Her breathing began to synchronize with mine, and the trembling diminished until it became just a light vibration, like the purring of a scared cat that found shelter. Then, she lifted her face, still very close to mine. In the dark, I couldn't see her eyes, but I felt the heat of her breath hitting my lips. The atmosphere changed in a snap. The fear was going away, but it left in its place a different tension, electric and dangerous. She didn't pull away. On the contrary, I felt her hand move up my arm and touch my face, a soft and hesitant touch that made my stomach drop. I never imagined silence could be as loud as in that moment. After Allison's sobs ceased, what remained was only the sound of our breaths intertwined in the dark, an intimate symphony that filled every inch of that freezing storage room. The storm outside seemed like a distant reality, a world apart, while inside, on the dirty concrete floor, we had created a small private universe where the office rules didn't apply. My hands remained on her back, making a circular and slow movement that I didn't even notice starting. It was instinctive, an attempt to keep the panic monster away, but every time my palm grazed the fine fabric of her silk shirt, I felt an electric discharge run through my arm. The woman I was holding wasn't the iron executive who humiliated me in Monday meetings. She was someone soft, warm, and frighteningly human. Her smell invaded my senses in an overwhelming way. That imported citrus perfume, which I previously associated with arrogance and distance, was now mixed with the natural heat of her skin and the salt of the cold sweat drying. It was an intoxicating aroma, sweet and complex, that made me dizzy in a way the lack of air in the basement never could. I caught myself inhaling deeply, wanting to keep that scent in my memory. A silent confession that, perhaps, I had never hated that perfume, only the barrier it represented. Allison made no move to pull away, even when the trembling of her body stopped completely. On the contrary, she seemed to have merged with me, fitting her head into the curve of my neck as if that were her rightful place. I felt her cold nose graze my sensitive skin, just below the ear, and a violent shiver went down my spine, making my fingers contract involuntarily against her waist. The darkness gave us a courage that daylight would never allow. I knew that if the lights came on at that instant, we would pull away with shame, fixing our clothes and stuttering apologies. But in the pitch black, without the judgment of each other's eyes, we could just be two bodies seeking comfort. I allowed myself to rest my chin on top of her head, feeling the silky texture of her blonde hair, which was now free of that rigid and untouchable style she wore. It was then that the realization hit with the weight of an anchor. Allison fit perfectly in my arms. That realization was dangerous. For 3 years, I saw her as an unattainable statue, a rival made of marble and ambition. But there, feeling her weight on my legs and the heat of her chest rising and falling against mine, I realized she was just a woman, a beautiful, vulnerable woman who, for some mysterious reason, trusted me enough to collapse. She sighed, a long and shaky sound that vibrated against my sternum. With her voice hoarse and muffled against my blouse, she whispered an almost inaudible apology. She said she felt ridiculous, that she didn't want me to see her like that, weak and pathetic. The self-criticism in her voice was so heavy that I wanted to cry for her, to protect her from her own cruel mind that demanded perfection even during a panic attack. I tightened the hug, pulling her even closer, if that was possible. I responded softly, my mouth brushing her temple, saying she didn't need to apologize for being human. I said everyone is afraid of something, and that she was safe with me. My voice came out more affectionate than I intended, loaded with an intimacy we hadn't built. But that seemed to have been born ready in that instant. Her body relaxed completely with my words, becoming heavy and surrendered. I felt her hand, which before gripped my clothes with desperation, soften its touch. Allison's long, thin fingers began to trace a slow path up my arm, rising from the elbow to the shoulder, in a hesitant caress that made me hold my breath. It was no longer a touch of fear. It was a touch of recognition, of exploration. The temperature in the storage room seemed to have risen 10 degrees. The cold of the concrete beneath us was forgotten, replaced by the feverish heat emanating from the contact of our bodies. I felt every curve of hers pressed against me, the volume of her breasts, the curve of her hip, her leg that, unintentionally, intertwined with mine. The line separating maternal care from physical desire began to blur, becoming as dark as the environment around us. My heart, which had already calmed down from the initial fright, began to race again, but now, for a completely different reason. The excessive proximity, the isolation, her breathing hitting my neck, all of that awakened a tension that was dormant, buried under layers of bickering and rivalry. I realized the anger we felt for each other might just be the other side of a much more intense and dangerous coin. Suddenly, Allison raised her head slowly. Even without seeing anything, I knew her face was millimeters from mine. I felt her warm breath hit my lips, sweet and inviting, and my mouth went dry instantly. She didn't pull away, didn't retreat to the safe space of a coworker. She stayed there, still, in that forbidden zone where friendship ends and something overwhelming begins, waiting for me to make the next move or push her away. The darkness, which minutes before seemed like a monster ready to devour us, now transformed into a velvet cloak, protecting that moment of intimacy I never judged possible. The shiver that ran through my body wasn't from cold, but rather an electric reaction to the proximity of Allison's face, which remained there, stopped inches from mine, sustaining a tension that made the air seem dense. I could feel her breathing, now calmer and rhythmic, caressing my cheek like a warm breeze, loaded with a hesitation that shouted louder than any word. She didn't pull away, and that permanence was the first silent confession that something fundamental had changed between us. On any other day, in that lit office full of rules, Allison would have retreated as if I were contagious, smoothing her skirt and raising her chin in that defensive posture I knew so well. But there, on the dirty floor of the dead archive, she seemed to have forgotten who she was outside, or perhaps for the first time. She was allowing herself to be just who she was inside. A woman tired of holding up the weight of the world alone. It was her voice that broke the silence. A hoarse and fragile whisper that vibrated against the bones of my chest, since we were glued to one another. Allison murmured that I must be laughing at her inside, that I must be loving seeing the all-powerful executive director crumble because of a simple lack of light. There was so much bitterness and shame in that sentence that my heart tightened, and I felt an urgent need to erase that distorted image she had of herself and of me. I responded instinctively, my fingers caressing her neck almost imperceptibly, saying I would never laugh at something like that. I spoke with the sincerity of someone who has nothing left to lose, confessing that in truth, I admired her for holding on so long without breaking. I said no one is made of iron all the time, and that seeing her like this, so human and sensitive, only made her more real to me, undoing the myth of the untouchable wax doll she had built. Then came the revelation that dismantled me. With a choked voice, she confessed that the bickering, the criticism, and the jabs were never hate. They were jealousy. She said she envied my freedom, the way I laughed in the break room, and my capacity to be myself. According to her, my light exposed how gray and programmed her life was. That fell on me like a bomb, dissolving 3 years of hurt in a second. Moved by a courage only darkness provides, I brought my hand to her face. My trembling fingers traced the outline of Allison's jaw, feeling the soft, warm skin. There was no retreat, no slap on the hand. She tilted her face toward my touch, closing her eyes. I knew this because her long lashes brushed my palm and let out a sigh of surrender that echoed in the depths of my soul. I whispered back that I also felt envy of her. I confessed I thought she was the most beautiful and competent woman who had ever stepped in that building, and that my defensive posture was just fear of never being good enough for her standard. It was my turn to be vulnerable, to surrender weapons and show my belly. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled by a magnetic energy, a gravitational attraction pulling our bodies closer, if that was physically possible. Allison's hand, which was resting on my shoulder, moved slowly up my neck. Her touch was firm, possessive, and at the same time delicate, sending waves of heat to every nerve ending in my body. She wove her fingers into my hair, at the base of my neck, and pulled lightly, tilting my head back, exposing my throat and leaving me at the mercy of that moment. The smell of her perfume was everywhere now, impregnating my clothes and my senses. A sweet drug leaving me intoxicated. Our breaths mixed, the air leaving her lungs entering mine, creating a vicious cycle of intimacy. I felt her heart beating against my chest, an accelerated rhythm betraying that, underneath that rational conversation, existed a pulsing and urgent desire, screaming to be released. There was no more boss or secretary, rich or poor, suburbs or city. There was just Allison and Hannah, 2 women who discovered, in the most unlikely way, that the line between hate and love is as thin as a strand of hair. I felt her lips brush the corner of my mouth, an almost accidental touch, a silent question asked in the dark, and my answer was to stop thinking and let myself be carried away by the gravity of that delicious abyss. The kiss didn't start like in romance movies, with soft music and calculated movements. It was a collision, a thermal shock between 2 bodies that had been orbiting each other for too long and finally gave in to gravity. When Allison's lips found mine, the sensation was one of desperate urgency, as if we were trying to recover all the oxygen we lacked during those years of silence and exchanged barbs. The first touch was hesitant for just a fraction of a second, the exact time for the brain to register that the forbidden line had been crossed. But right after, Allison let out a shaky sigh, a sound that vibrated in my mouth, and deepened the kiss with a will that left me stunned. Her hands, which before caressed my neck with delicacy, now buried themselves in my hair with force, pulling me closer, as if she wanted to fuse our feelings right there, in that darkness. I responded with the same intensity, moved by an emotion that had nothing to do with fear of the storage room, My hands went down her back, feeling the silk of her shirt until finding her narrow waist, pulling her body against mine until not a millimeter of space was left between us. The hug was firm. I felt her heart beating out of rhythm against my chest, in an accelerated pace mirroring my own internal chaos. That kiss tasted of bitter office coffee, of salty tears, and of a repressed passion that, now released, warmed everything around. There was no technique or delicacy, just a deep need to feel, to be close. It was a silent dialogue where we confessed everything we never had the courage to say, the hidden admiration, the suffocated affection, the loneliness we both carried behind our professional masks. Allison, the woman always contained and cold, kissed with a surrender that fascinated me. The touch of her lips sought mine with a greed that made me lose my footing, and I had to lean on the metal shelf behind me to keep my balance. The noise of our accelerated breathing and the soft sound of our contact were the only soundtrack in that basement, amplified by the sepulchral silence surrounding us. In a quick movement, she reversed positions, pressing me against the cold file shelf. The freezing metal on my back contrasted with the heat of her body in front of me, creating an intense sensation. I felt her body press mine with more force, a firm and instinctive approach that made me sigh against her mouth, sending waves of affection to every extremity of my body. My hands traveled over her face, memorizing in the dark the features I so often observed from afar: the straight nose, the prominent cheekbones, the soft skin that was now hot. I wanted to touch everything, wanted to be sure that was real. To every touch of mine, she responded with a surrendered sigh, completely different from the authoritarian official who terrorized the floor above. We kissed as if the world were going to end there, in that dusty storage room. Time seemed to have stopped. I didn't know if 10 seconds or 10 minutes had passed. I only knew that, for the first time in my entire life in that office, I felt whole, seen, and wanted. The rivalry, the difference in positions, the social abyss separating us, all of that lost importance in the face of that overwhelming connection. There was a moment when we separated just enough to breathe, but without breaking the embrace. Our foreheads remained glued, and I felt the warm air coming from her hit my face. She whispered my name, Hannah, with an intimacy that gave me chills, as if tasting the sound of it for the first time without the tone of disdain. That was more intimate than the kiss itself, a validation that I was no longer invisible. But the truce was short-lived. The attraction was too strong, and soon we went back to seeking each other, now with a different rhythm, slower, more affectionate. I bit her lower lip softly, feeling her shudder in my arms, and realized clearly that I was completely in love with that woman. The anger had just been a shield, a safe way to keep distance from something I knew could change my life. We were immersed in that bubble of affection and discovery, oblivious to any danger. I had forgotten the locked door, the difficult boss, the storm outside. In that instant, the universe boiled down to her smell and the sensation of her hands on my waist. I felt safe, protected by the very darkness that frightened us before. It was then that reality decided to invade our sanctuary. In the middle of a kiss, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze instantly. The loud metallic click of the lock on the outside being manually unlocked. The noise of the handle turning echoed in the silence of the storage room, announcing that our time was up and the real world was about to walk through the door. The beam of the security guard's flashlight cut through the darkness like a blade, hitting us full on and forcing us to cover our eyes with the brutality of the sudden brightness. We separated with a jump, hearts pounding, stumbling backward like two criminals caught red-handed at the scene of the crime. The change in atmosphere was so violent it made me dizzy. 1 second I was in paradise, tasting Allison, and the next I was back in the freezing hell of the basement, blinking blindly in front of Mr. Henderson. The old security guard stared at us with his mouth half open, holding the flashlight with a shaking hand, visibly embarrassed to have interrupted something he couldn't fully identify, but which hung in the heavy air of the storage room. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of the building's generator finally kicking in, bringing back a cold electric hum that seemed to judge our conduct. Allison was the first to regain composure, or at least try. She smoothed her skirt with quick, nervous movements, clearing her throat. But her voice came out cracked and hoarse when she tried to explain that we got stuck. The excuse sounded weak, almost childish, in the face of the glaring evidence stamped on our faces and bodies, wrinkled clothes, panting breath, and static electricity that almost shot sparks between us. Mr. Henderson, a simple and kind man who had worked there for 20 years, looked away respectfully, muttering a clumsy apology. He said the system had gone down with the lightning strike, and he came to do the manual rounds to check if anyone was in the building. He asked no questions, made no accusations, but the way he glanced quickly at Allison's neck and then at the floor told me everything. He knew, or at least suspected, that this hadn't been just a work conversation. We left the storage room almost running, marching toward the service elevator without daring to look at each other. Shame burned my cheeks, mixed with residual adrenaline that made my hands shake. When the elevator doors closed, isolating us again, I hoped the magical moment would return. But the fluorescent and merciless light of the cabin exposed the raw reality. We were wrecked. The elevator mirror was cruel. I saw my reflection and almost didn't recognize myself. My hair was a bird's nest, my blouse was misaligned, and worst of all, my mouth was swollen and red, with smeared lipstick crossing the lip line. I looked at Allison, and the image was the same. The perfect woman was disheveled, eyes shining in a feverish way, and an unmistakable smudge of my lipstick on her chin. Before we could return to our desks or leave the building, Allison pulled me by the arm into the women's restroom in the lobby. We locked the main door and ran to the sinks. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't hostile anymore. It was complicit and urgent. With a piece of wet paper towel, Allison approached me and, with a delicacy that dismantled me, began to wipe the red smudge from the corner of my mouth. That simple gesture of cleaning the traces of our crime was as intimate as the kiss. Our eyes met in the mirror while we fixed ourselves, and I saw genuine fear in her gaze, mixed with a desire that still hadn't faded. We didn't talk about what happened, didn't exchange phone numbers, didn't define our relationship status. We just fixed ourselves, pretended we were the usual professionals, and left the building separately, each to her car, fleeing the storm and ourselves. The weekend was a slow, silent torture. I spent Saturday and Sunday staring at my bedroom ceiling, reliving every second of those 10 minutes in the dark. Doubt corroded me. Was it real? Would she go back to being the cold boss on Monday and pretend nothing happened? Anxiety tightened my chest every time my cell phone vibrated, waiting for a message from her that never came. Monday dawned gray, reflecting my mood. I arrived at the office with my stomach in knots, feeling as if I had a neon sign on my forehead saying guilty. When I saw Allison in the hallway, my heart stopped. She was impeccable again, armor rebuilt, but when our eyes met for a fraction of a second, I saw the mask fall. She smiled, a tiny and almost imperceptible smile. Just for me. That was enough to give me hope. But our little bubble of secrecy and complicity was about to burst catastrophically. Just before lunch, the intercom on my desk buzzed. It was the nasal, arrogant voice of Mr. Sterling. He requested with frightening calm that Allison and I report immediately to his office. The tone wasn't one of scolding. It was something much worse. Amusement. We entered the president's office feeling the freezing air conditioning chill our sweat. Sterling was sitting in his swivel leather chair, back to us, looking at the view of the bay. He spun slowly, with a reptilian smile on his thin lips. He didn't tell us to sit. He just pointed the remote control at the large television screen on the side wall used for video conferences. With a dry click of the button, the screen came to life. The image was black and white, grainy, with that ghostly night vision look. My blood froze and stopped circulating. I immediately recognized the metal shelves, the file boxes, and the two silhouettes on the floor. There it was, recorded in high digital definition. The hug, the comfort, and then the kiss. The long, desperate, undeniable kiss. Sterling paused the video at the exact moment Allison's hand was in my hair and my body was pressed against hers. The silence in the room was deadly. He leaned back in his chair, interlaced his fingers, and looked at us with the triumph of someone who just won the lottery. "I always said security in this office was top priority," he said, voice dripping with venom. "Did you really think I didn't monitor my own archive? Now, my dears, we need to talk about your future at this company." To be continued. If you want to know how Allison and I faced this blackmail and what happened after that video stopped playing, don't miss the continuation of this story. The outcome of our redemption comes out shortly, right here on the channel.